times I danced unprofessionally on Broadway, which was actually quite often, so I stopped dancing. I want to thank Mary and Anne and Kelly and Annika and Christine and the whole Hamline community for inviting me to deliver the commencement today. I'd like to tell you about how my childhood bullies helped me find my voice, what my mentor taught me about producing hit Broadway musicals, and which website has become my most comforting resource as a writer. And I will tell you about those things today. But first, not a disclaimer, but a little backstory, even though you should never open with backstory. Before arriving in St. Paul, I was in New Orleans for a big national cocktail conference because I moonlight as a writer of these cocktail recipe books when I'm not influencing literally dozens of America's children. As I was walking around trying to avoid drunk people this week, I began second-guessing everything that I had planned out to say to you all. I titled my speech, Making It Up As You Go Along, but the truth is I didn't want to be off the cuff today, especially after this particular residency. I wanted to be a little academic and a lot smart. Because, you see, I feel like a little bit of an imposter. I don't quite feel as if I've earned the right to give a commencement address because I didn't even go to my own high school graduation. I missed it to be in a musical. That wasn't a joke. I have been cast in a production of Oklahoma happening in North Carolina after graduating with a 2.2 GPA from a high school in Pennsylvania, following a string of C's in English. I never read the required reading, and I never dreamed of being a writer. I was, in the truest sense, making it up as I went along, also known as faking it. Once, when I was cutting a science class, the hall monitor said, "Excuse me, young man, where are you supposed to be right now?" And I said, "Broadway," and I kept walking. If only I could have told my future self that everything that got me picked on in middle school would someday get me paid. Another reason I felt like an imposter leading up to this speech today is because I didn't even attend my own college graduation, in part because I didn't get into college. I got into a grand total of one theater conservatory, and it was an environment when I visited it that I sort of thought might eat me alive. At the end of every school year at this conservatory, they were famous for ruthlessly cutting a number of students from the program, and that frightened me because I thought if I get cut from the only school that accepted me for the only thing I've ever been good at, it will crush me and send me into a tailspin. Also, when I visited this conservatory, I picked up a tone in the air of bitter rivalry, and I knew enough about myself at 18 to know that if I went to this conservatory and actually survived all 4 years, I would come out of it perhaps a marginally better singer and dancer, but also much edgier. Like those folks you know whose chief form of bonding with one another is to cut them down. This has been a hard thing to overcome in my adult life because my sharpest knife is my wit, which was honed after years of being bullied for being the only boy in 3rd grade who knew every lyric to Into the Woods. Add to my imposter list the fact that I missed my own MFA commencement address because I didn't get an MFA. I have no degrees, you're ahead of me. The point here is that I can speak at a college, but you can all teach at one, which is huge. So as you can see, I had reason to feel like an imposter, but then I sort of thought, that hasn't stopped me before. I didn't get a degree, but I did get to Broadway at age 22, hall monitor, be damned. And I stayed put throughout my 20s, except for this little break where I went on the national tour of Spamalot as the dance captain. And I know dance captain sounds like a gay superhero, but the job is actually to teach and tell the other dancers how to do the steps well. And it was approximately 10 years ago that I was the dance captain of Spamalot, and I didn't even know then that what I really wanted to be doing was not maintaining worlds, but creating them. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about children's literature, which is getting a lot of ink these days, and which leads me to my second and more timely reason why I began really doubting if this commencement address was right for me to give, and that's because I've been struggling in recent days to remember what unites us as a community. The only privilege that everyone in this room shares is that we write for children. And for that reason, and for everything going on in the world right now, not to mention right here, I have frankly been feeling a little bit uncomfortable leading up to this speech. But then, when I was doubting that I was even the right person to talk to you all, I had a thought, which is that I was born with the luck, and yes, even the privilege, of feeling only occasionally uncomfortable, whereas many people feel uncomfortable all the time, marginalized and even scared, particularly in societies and industries that don't always or sometimes even ever feel welcoming to them. And so in the spirit of what makes writers a writer, which is not getting published or getting paid or getting a degree, but actually getting up every day and facing the page, even when you feel uncomfortable, here I am showing up. Now, I know I'm talking about two very different kinds of uncomfortable here, but if there's one thing the real-life Tim has learned from the writer Tim, it's that the feeling of discomfort frequently comes right before a moment of breakthrough, as long as you show up and you stay put. Real writers and not hobby writers feel uncomfortable all the time. It's what unites everyone in this room, even if very little else about us, from subject matter in our work to who we identify as off the page, is it all alike. Being uncomfortable and yet writing is the feeling that we cannot face another blank page and yet we do. Being uncomfortable and writing is the feeling you cannot face another one-star review that says, and I quote, "I couldn't actually load the book onto my grandson's e-reader, so I'm going to give it 1 star," which actually happened to me. We push through this discomfort, we surprise ourselves, we revise our drafts and hopefully our thinking, and that makes us writers, making it up as we go along and making it better as we do. So I'm walking around New Orleans earlier this week, and I'm feeling kind of anxious about this speech, and so I do what I always do when I'm feeling anxious. I had carbs. And so in this case it was beignets, and then cocktails, because New Orleans. And then I did what I actually always do, which is I found a bookstore. And I don't know if this has ever happened to anybody here, but sometimes you walk into a bookstore with no point, and you get drawn almost magnetically to one book. And I got drawn to a play, actually, written in 1992, incidentally the year that I made my professional debut in a production of Oliver, which was not incidentally the year that I started feeling different from the other boys. And the play that I found in New Orleans at this bookstore this past Tuesday was called Geoffrey by Paul Rudnick, a celebrated comedic writer. I see Emily Jenkins shaking her head. Theater people, I love that. I browsed this bookstore, I picked up Geoffrey, and I bought it because it was $2, and because as a novelist, you can't actually go into a bookstore and not buy a book, or else you're haunted by the spirit of James Patterson, which is true. So $2 and 3 beignets later, I went back for a carb refill. I read Paul Rudnick's intro to Geoffrey, the play, and in it he said something that really resonated with me. Geoffrey is about a mid-30s man living in New York City during the height of the AIDS crisis in New York, which is a time in history when not speaking out could actually be deadly. So here are Paul's words from the intro. I tried to think beyond these immediate events to some more universal theory of how love and death can be understood only by developing a truly exquisite sense of humor. Well, there I am with beignets in my mouth and powdered sugar on my shirt, thinking about how throughout history we learn and we forget and then we learn again that not speaking out and occasionally using an exquisite sense of humor to do so can actually be deadly. That it's our responsibility to tell our tale and to honor our past and our pain and our joy as 100% valid, because those things are ours, full stop. Now, I know this parenthetically because Better Nate Than Ever is basically my story, and so when people say to me, "Is Nate you?" I want to go, they're all me. The whole thing is me. It's a 250-page autobiography with some details changed. Anyway, I swallowed my beignet and I kept reading a little bit more from Paul's intro to Geoffrey. During the early readings of this show, I struggled to achieve a balance of comedy and sorrow, because I wanted audiences to find laughter where least expected and tears that were neither easy nor exploitive. Well, this sort of ding-a-linged in my head, in part because the number one thing I'm accused of as a writer and a speaker and a boyfriend is being too jokey. Meg Rossoff, the writer, did not blur Better Nate Than Ever because she told me it was too jokey. She really hates my punny titles, all of them. But the truth is that being jokey, finding the funny in and around situations that could have ended me, like when all the boys in my school found out that I took ballet and stopped calling me Federle and started calling me Femmerly. Well, laughing alongside those boys and saying, actually that's not like terrible from a pun standpoint, sort of saved my life. Maybe not literally, because these were word bullies, not gun bullies. But my humor saved my life as much as their bullying gave me one. Because without that hardship, which was frankly more of an annoyance than an actual problem, I might not have gotten funny at all. I do believe one of the chief jobs, not just of writers, but of adults, is to decide which of the many difficult things that come up in life are authentic problems and which things are merely annoyances. And only we can decide that for ourselves. Years later, I based all of Nate's tormentors in Better Nate Than Ever on the very boys who smashed my face into water fountains, which leads to perhaps my only really good piece of advice today, which is make it up as you go along, yes, but don't forget to base the villains in your books on the bullies from the past, as long as, again, you change their identifying characteristics. What I've learned over the years, even into my adulthood, even as somebody who delivers national lectures on the culture of bullying, is that everyone everywhere is at some point a bully, at some point bullied, and almost always something in between, like brackish water that isn't quite sure which river it flows from or which ocean it empties into. I mentioned how I go around giving speeches to grown-ups, but I really prefer to talk to kids because they're really honest. They can only sit still for so long, so there's an expectation that it's going to be a teeny tiny speech. And they will tell you when your readings are boring because they'll start hitting each other, which sometimes happens. And you hear from a lot of them. I had one kid write and say, I think you should title the third Nate book, which I didn't even know I was writing, A Midsummer Nate's Dream. That is such a good title. I started a Google Doc called Possible Titles. Incidentally, I hear from a lot of sensitive young boys, and when libraries say they don't want to carry Better Nate Than Ever because there's no gay kids in their community, I like to write back, well, how many wizards do you have? Anyway, you learn so much from the people. You learn a lot from the people who you are supposedly teaching, and I have a feeling that the Hamline faculty feels the same way. Here are, for example, a few things the grads have said that have served as recent reminders for me because I found out Hamline had a blog and I read up on you guys. Katie Coons reminded me that, quote, everyone was brilliant and confident when she first arrived at Hamline, but, quote, I was not, I am not. Which really hit me because when I teach Broadway dance classes to kids across the country, I like to say to them, what do you think is the number one thing that makes you stand out at an audition? And every kid from Santa Monica to St. Petersburg says the same thing. They say confidence. When I was a kid, at my school, we had these confidence posters with eagles on them. And so I spent my entire life waiting for an eagle to swoop down and give me confidence wings. And you know what? Screw confidence. Actually, it's so much more important to be courageous. Don't wait until you feel confident to query your first agent or do anything that you think might make you proud later, including speaking out when you feel wronged. Everything I've ever truly earned came out of a place of total fear. And the only thing bigger than my fear was my courage, including the time I dyed my hair red. When I read Sonia Solter's interview, she talked about first arriving at Hamline and how, quote, despite this exhaustion, I had the time of my life. This got my attention because everyone I know, every writer I know who has an interesting story to tell and one worth hearing is exhausted a lot of the time. To work in publishing is to almost always be constantly chasing something, an agent, a publishing deal, publicity, bestseller status, and then finally, ironically, peace. The most exhausting chase of all, inner peace. Being exhausted, at least occasionally, is the price of admission for ambitious people, and Sonia reminded me of that. Lastly, because for the love of Pete, we gotta wrap this up, I read Tashi Sahabataba say that during her time at Hamline, she learned to, quote, pay attention to my characters and their needs. A character always has a story to tell. One of the delighted surprises I have learned Writing for children is that they will write to you and tell you that you actually wrote their story, that you actually stole their life story. I'm thinking of Hudson and Emma, a boy and a girl who wrote to me together to say, quote, "We're so similar to Nate and Libby, it's actually pretty scary how much we relate to your characters. We're both awkward theater geeks who dream of being on Broadway. Hudson got his big break because he just made it into the American Boy Choir School, which is very amazing, and special, and cool, and every other adjective you could possibly think of. Also, Emma, who is writing you this email, is very supportive of him like Libby is supportive of Nate." These emails pour in, and the tears pour down. What Tashi, and I suspect a lot of you already know, is that characters have stories they have to tell, like people do. Tashi, rock on with your phantom trains. I can't wait to hear your character stories. I've learned a lot just talking to you 12 graduates earlier on today. It dawned on me, in fact, that a lot of amazing things come in packs of 12. There's 12 days of Christmas, there's 12 people in a jury, 12 eggs in a carton. Then, of course, there's the 12 disciples who became the 12 apostles, which means that after this speech, historically speaking, one of you will betray me. Kidding aside, I know I'm not your mentor, we've only just met, but mentors can take on so many different forms, as you know if you've ever read The Hero's Journey. A mentor of mine produced The Little Mermaid on Broadway. It was the last show I danced in on Broadway, in part because I was 30 and my knees were giving out, and in part because I had to wear a seagull costume, and I kind of went, enough is enough. My mentor recently said something to me. He said, "Do you know what you learn when you produce a hit?" This is the guy who produced The Lion King. And so I said, "No, what do you learn when you produce a hit?" And he said, "Nothing. You learn nothing from success. You only learn from flops." So I thought I would leave the graduates today with a few things I flopped at as a young writer so that you don't have to. Don't wait for good news before you start writing the next thing. I did. You're going to write your best stuff, some of it at least, when you're unpublished and hungry and waiting to hear if anybody real takes you seriously who you have not paid to take you seriously. But don't wait till your first book gets bought, as I did, before starting the second or third one. Don't wait for your first reviews either. Write in a place of total non-expectation for as long as you can, because your weakness as writers right now is actually your greatest strength, which is that you are virtually unknown. And that means there's no expectations. It's like a bunch of orchids who haven't been discovered in a beautiful greenhouse. Another thing I failed at that you don't have to, don't only write what you know, because if you're me, you will run out after Broadway, tequila, and burritos. Another thing I failed at that you don't have to, don't believe anybody else's definition of writer. I did for almost my entire life. And thus I never dreamed I could be a writer. That's despite the fact that my brother studied under Tobias Wolff at Stanford. This is despite the fact that my father is a celebrated writer of medical textbooks. This is despite the fact that I dated a national book-nominated novelist in my 20s, and later in my 20s, a soap opera writer. If you think I'm a prolific writer, you should see me date. The point is, I was so close to all of these writers, and yet I didn't think I had the permission to do it. It was only when my dear friend Jerry Steinkellner, the TV and musical comedy writer, said to me, "For God's sakes, Tim, be the writer you wish to date in the world." That I actually realized if I was going to do anything with my life that I was still proud of, post-Mermaid, I was going to have to redefine the word writer to mean, that means don't believe a writer is somebody who writes every day, don't believe a writer is somebody published, don't believe a writer is somebody with a certain Amazon rank, Goodreads score, Twitter follower count, or God forbid, pedigree. A writer is somebody who writes, a writer is U12. Lastly, when those closest to you tell you that you're driving yourself and them crazy in the months leading up to the publication of your debut novel, know that they are only doing this because they've never cared about something as much as you care about writing, and thus they are to be honored but ignored. Since my first book came out, I've been making it up as I go along. You will too. We're all making it up as we go along, and with each new success or failure, however we define that, we are changing the target or moving it. So I'm going to send you 12 out with a challenge. Write yourself a private note at this great website called futureme.org. The next couple of days, I want you to write a note to yourself. And I wanted to say, by the time you read this email, dear OJ, dear Katie, write to yourselves. By the time you read this email, I want you to have accomplished this, this, and this. Did you? Love your former self. See if you hit your target. You're this, you're this, you're this. Be gentle with yourself if you don't quite have the agent yet, if you don't get those starred reviews that you want. Be even more gentle with yourself if you do get all those things and it's not quite what you thought it would be. No matter what, keep writing. I recently received a letter from myself 5 years ago. It said, it was futureme.org, "Dear Tim, you just made it to page 111 writing your first novel. I hope you're still going." Whew, the air in St. Paul is so thin. The title of the book is Quinn Victorious, Did It Happen? Love Your Former Self. That book didn't happen. That book didn't happen. But it got me my agent. All these years later, I rewrote Quinn Victorious, a novel then intended for adults, from page 1. I set the entire thing 10 years earlier in high school. That book comes out next March as my YA debut under the title The Great American Whatever. By the way, May Rosoff blurbed it. Last thing, I once got the advice to give up on any book that isn't working after a year. So my last piece of advice to you all is that you stop taking everyone's advice. I can pinpoint the moment myself when listening to the great big chatterbox that is the world almost drove me over the edge. When Better Nate Than Ever was on submission to editors, I read a blog by a published author who claimed that if your inciting incident didn't happen before page 12 of a middle grade novel, you would never get purchased. And I freaked out. I texted my therapist, "When's your next appointment?" And 2 days later, Nate sold. So, the number one thing that I failed at, that you guys don't have to, is at a certain point you have to stop seeking advice about writing and you just have to write. A blank page is so much harder to edit than a steaming jumble of words that might actually contain something beautiful and unexpected. So stop listening to advice. Stop writing with 100 voices in your heads and write with the only one you've got. I made a joke earlier that with 12 people in front of me I expected to be betrayed, but that is not true. First of all, I'd never get cast as Jesus because in both Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar, he's a tenor and I'm a bass. But the real answer is the only person you can betray as a writer is yourself by not writing. So get back to work, and along the way, if you feel like an imposter, or you feel uncomfortable, or you feel like you're just making it up as you go along, know that what you're really feeling is what it's like to be a writer. It's the best job in the world, especially when you write for children, as long as you keep showing up. Thank you so much for having me here today.